Hi there everyone, my name is Forrest and I'm going to go ahead and be presenting to you System Hardening for Beginners, and we're going to be specializing about accounts on this time around. So there are a variety of accounts that we can use, and specifically we're going to be scoping in on a few different subjects here. But the main thing to understand is that we're going to be really talking about user accounts, and whenever it comes down to the account scope, we're not going to be talking about service accounts, we're not going to be talking about APIs or anything else like that. We're really just going to be talking about local accounts. Potentially you can use those as domain accounts and so on and so forth. But this is really, again, for that beginner scope. It's not something that we're going to go ahead and leverage as an advanced or intermediary sort of knowledge base here. So this is going to be a very entry level beginner, somebody that's really just getting started with this and really wanting to learn a bit more about how they go ahead and leverage these user based accounts, right? So without further ado, let's dive directly into this. All right, so again, this is a system hardening for beginners. It's a very entry level, it's a very beginner, as it sounds like, sort of coursework here. And this is really just going ahead and introducing you to a lot of these concepts that we tend to face every single day in cybersecurity and information technology, and even just using our computers, right? The main purpose of this course as well, again, to iterate, this is a course designed for Alphagrad, the Discord community, and as well the website, based around Alphagrad Academy, right? So we're going ahead and partnering with them to go ahead and provide this coursework and being able to provide this instruction level information. So let's go ahead and dive right into what this means and what scoping we're going to be talking about. So, what is an account? So, an account, as you may have heard me allude to, right, it doesn't always mean something of Forrest is logging in, right? That can be something that we set in to be interactive. That can be something that is, Forrest is typing in his password, he logs in, he does whatever else it may be. As well, that can be something of a service account, right? And basically, what that means is that a service, think of essentially the weather applications, right? We all have smart information or Internet of Technology. We all have various smart thermostats, so on and so forth, in our homes, for the most part. Think about these service accounts. How do they go ahead and talk to one another, right? So typically you'll have an application that is developed in-house in an enterprise, and you'll have a service account, right? And that'll be something of a service account application A. And that is only communicating with this application and nothing else. So if you have application B, nope, no communication, right? Ideally. Now, as well, that's grossly oversimplifying it, and that's also a bit of beyond the scope of this course. So, what we want to really discuss in this one, we want to talk about the accounts as a form of authentication, right? So, with that, again, accounts are a form of authentication. Now, if you're not too sure what authentication is, don't worry. Again, this is a beginner level course. So, authentication basically just means how you're going ahead and logging in, right? That can be something as simple as you have a username and you have a password. That can even be just you have a username, right? That's a form of authentication. Now, that said, it's not exactly the most secure, but that is a form of authentication, right? Now, whenever it comes down to it, authentication has a lot of different layers. I'm not going to pretend to be the subject matter expert and challenge all of these other experts on it. But the reality of it is that this goes ahead and takes your credentials, right? This, hey, Forrest is logging in. Well, what kind of permissions does Forrest have? Is Forrest an admin on this computer? Is Forrest just a guest on this computer? Those are the sort of questions that authentication has to answer, right? And again, that might not always include a password. I'll go ahead and give you an example of that. Again, that doesn't mean that, hey, we're just saying passphrase instead of password, so haha, gotcha, right? This is something of, it could literally just be a username. But we're going to go ahead and give some further examples in a few slides here. But one of the key things before moving on is that we want to go ahead and understand that there are different layers, different permissions, right? So there's going to be administrative level accounts. So if you're a Windows user, you're going to know those as the admins, the administrator accounts. If you're a Linux user, or a Unix user, you're probably going to know those as root, right? Uh, Additionally, there are guest accounts, right? Think about all of those public computers that might honestly be used, be it at a car dealership, be it at a public library, be it at whatever, right? You're expecting a multitude of people to leverage those assets to go ahead and being able to access the computer at that point. As well, there are those user layer accounts, right? So user accounts tend to be something of where you set up grandma, right? Grandma is going to be a user on your machine now. You want to make sure that she can play solitaire, whatever it may be. But grandma is going to be a user account, right? Maybe not the guest, but definitely not the admin, right? You don't want grandma to go ahead and change all the system settings. So again, those are a few different examples of what an account might be. And again, these are various different types of accounts. There are a multitude beyond just administrator, guest, and user. We're going to discuss those in the upcoming slides here. But the important thing to take away from this is that you have an extremely diverse set of accounts that can be used throughout systems and system hardening. Now, for the purposes of this course, right, we're going to go ahead and say, it'll entail the basic kinds of accounts. Now, what do we mean by that? And in no way are we trying to say these are oversimplified. In no way are we trying to say these are just the easy accounts or anything like that, right? They can be very diverse. They can have a lot of different permissions and so on and so forth. But for the purposes of this course, we're going to be talking about the basic kinds of accounts. Now, what those mean specifically is that we're going to have the administrator, the guest, and the user accounts. Those are going to be our three main ones that we work with and the three main ones that you interact with in your lab. Now, again, we're going to give a guided demo throughout this course, and we're going to also show what it looks like to authenticate on a user account in the upcoming slides here. So, let's go ahead and move on. One of the key things about this, and as well you can see this is from the types of user account in computer networking explained, there are a multitude of different types of user accounts. We're going to briefly just go through these. So system accounts, those tend to be used by those services. Commonly they're known as service accounts, or you might see them abbreviated as SAs, right? SA service account, right? Typically, those will never be an interactive sign-in. What that means is that you typically will never be logging in, entering in that username and password, right? If you're not in tech, you should probably never be interacting with these accounts. And if you are in tech, ideally you still should never be interacting with these accounts. It should be a one-time setup. That's it. It's done. Whatever else it may be, right? Additionally, if you're never working in tech, you might not even know these accounts exist, right? This might be something that your technology team goes ahead and sets up on your behalf, so that way your services, your products, and so on and so forth can work intertwined without any issues. Moving on, we have the super user account here. So again, super user, think of it, well, Superman, right? It's the highest privileged account on any of the operating system. That can be an admin on Windows, aka the administrator, and the root on Unix/Linux. Generally, you wouldn't want anybody logging into this, right? You want to go ahead and have a user account set up to be admin. You wouldn't want anybody to go ahead and say, I'm the administrator, I can go ahead and override anything, and no one knows who did what. Now again, the importance behind this, right? There are abilities to go ahead and enable this account. By default, on most cases, it is disabled unless it's a first time setting up. But we're going to really avoid going into the technical nitty gritty that comes with that and really focus on just, again, that beginner layer area. But the main thing to understand about that super user account, right? That means that you are literally the super user. You are literally able to control everything. From here, we have the regular user accounts. And these are typically the accounts that we get provisioned for at most of the jobs. Maybe whenever we purchase a computer, we go ahead and set up an account that are a user account. Those might be, the granted admin permissions. Those might be granted uh, uh, less than admin permissions. They might be able to just get by enough, but the main thing is, um, these are typically only allowing tasks that are required for the function, right? So again, going back to the example of grandma, right? Well, grandma might not need to go ahead and modify all of your registries. She might not need to go ahead and modify your system settings when something goes to sleep, whenever it has a reboot, what scans are going on, right? She might only need to play solitaire. So you don't necessarily need to give her admin access. You might want to just provision a regular user account and appropriate the correct permissions to that account. Now, again, although your personal computer, you might have an account, that doesn't mean that it does not have that administrative level access. So again, if you're the only user on your machine, you probably have administrative level access. If you are on a Windows and you try to right click and run as admin, you're probably not going to be provisioned or asked to go ahead and enter a password to do that, right? If you're in an enterprise, on the other hand, and your security team is very diligent or your IT team is very diligent, oftentimes you can't go ahead and run something as an administrator without a password and username of that administrative account. So, key importance to understand, the regular user account you can interact with, you can log into, you can type your username, password, your PIN. We'll elaborate a bit more on that upcoming here. But you can go ahead and interact with those. And the level of permissions will vary. As well, we have the guest user accounts, right? So these will be, again, those public libraries, the public access, any car dealerships that allow you to hop on their computer that they have sitting there that you probably don't want to enter in any personal information to, right? These accounts are generally those low level of permission accounts. They tend to be used for the internet, like surfing, maybe going to Facebook, Twitter, what have you, or even gaming, those very light sort of things like solitaire, maybe even RuneScape if you're a nerd like that, right? I know I am. So again, it's these very low layer permissions that don't require a lot of modifications. As well, movies, right? In a guest account, it's typically disabled by default in Windows, but you can easily enable it, and you can also easily put any user accounts that you want to. Maybe you want to call a guest account a custom account, right? You can easily put whatever user account as a guest level permission. Moving on here, we have the group account. They tend to be a bit more controversial. Typically, you don't want to have a group account in a modern day enterprise, right? These tend to have shared credentials across multiple people, and that tends to be very messy, right? Organizations tend to use these things called password vaults or password shares or whatever, those LastPasses, the key vaults, whatever it may be. And the issue is more and more of those continue to get breached. So, what's commonly occurring is these group accounts are being seen as insecure. And typically, unless you're in an enterprise, an organization, anything else like that, you would not go ahead and use a group account, right? You'd want to use your own account. You wouldn't want grandma and yourself to have the same account. So, group accounts, they tend to be more used in an enterprise environment. Still important to know, but not necessarily in the scope of what we're going to be covering here. Another one, local user accounts. Those tend to be tied to those accounts specifically to a machine. And so it's not anything of an identity. So think of it this way, right? You have Azure, or I'm sorry, you have Active Directory over here. Then you have your machine over here. Well, you can have a local account on this machine that is not tied into Active Directory whatsoever. So those accounts, they're very, very simplified. They're only machine based. It's not really an identity, and these typically aren't in a modern environment, be it that at an enterprise or even personal computing at this point. So even if you purchase a computer in a modern day, let's say Windows or anything else like that, you're typically prompted to sign in with your Outlook, right? That goes ahead and really deviates from the core premise of what local user accounts are. Moving on from there, we have the remote service accounts. Those typically are, again, those SAs. They tend to be those non-interactives, and they're used for software and are rarely leveraged for personal use, right? And then lastly, the anonymous user accounts. Generally, they're not really accounts. They're configurations in which a field of a user account can be set to anonymous. That way, an application, a login page, anything else like that can effectively allow access even if you don't have an account that corresponds with it, right? And typically that requires that it just passes through this guest or anonymous sort of styling with it. So it's not necessarily a user account, but it tends to be used for applications more or less. So moving on from here, again, I did want to just mention these examples of these different kind of user account logins, right? So both of these are interactive. Just because one says administrator and one says lab, both are interactive at this point in time. On the left here, you can see this lab that prompts you for a password. And that's essentially that splash page that whenever someone turns on their computer, they have to go ahead and authenticate with, right? And generally, this one on the left, again, that lab that says password, right? That's going to go ahead and be protected by a password. One that we went ahead and set up. You're going to be interacting with that in the guided lab. I'm going to be interacting with a very similar account in the demo, so on and so forth. Now the administrator account, though, we have enabled that for the purposes of this example. But as you can see, it does not require you to have a password or anything else like that, and it's enabled right now. If this was a real login page, I can go ahead and log in with the administrator account, right? So we have to just be very conscious about how we're going ahead and doing this, right? Now, one thing, right? Why would you, even if you're the only user on a computer, why wouldn't you want your administrator account enabled without some form of password protection? Now, if you've thought about that, if you have a little bit of time to think about that, right? Pause the video, what have you. So some of the common reasons, right? Well, your computer is not just isolated to where it physically is. If it is connected to the internet, that means a bad actor, those hackers, those malicious folks, they can go ahead and attempt to log in. Now, if you don't have even a password set up to go ahead and try to get into that administrator account, well, they're going to be easily able to get into that. Remember those default credentials, that case study we mentioned in the previous module here, right? That case study exemplified how that administrator on Unix-based devices, that root and root, were easily able to be logged into. Now imagine that you don't even have a password. It's just literally administrator, and that's it. So bad actors can go ahead and get on in with no issue whatsoever. As well, if this device is ever stolen, let's just say it's a laptop for the sake of example. If it's a laptop and it's ever stolen, well, guess what? You don't have a password on it. The person who goes ahead and steals it opens up the laptop and says, well, I can go ahead and log in as the administrator right now. No issue. So again, it's that defense in depth idea. It's that multiple layers of security idea. It's just those best practices ideas that although it seems very silly, right? You, as that individual user, don't want to open yourself up to unnecessary risks. So let's go ahead and move on from here. And we're going to go ahead and get into the demo. Alright, so getting into the demo, we're going to actually fire up a virtual machine that I have configured specifically for this live demo. So without further ado, let's go ahead and move on over here, and I'm just going to exit out of this tab here. And we're going to see my username, Forest is cool, awesome, awesome. So let's go ahead and enter in the password that I think it is. And we'll see if that goes ahead and authenticates. I believe it should, but we'll make sure. All right, and we can see I've just had this virtual machine for a decent chunk of time. It's telling me, hey, the Windows evaluation license is going to expire soon, so on and so forth. No big deal, we're going to close that out. So in this, we're going to start a demo about how we're looking at user accounts, right? So we're going to first go ahead and open up the accounts GUI, essentially, and that's the graphical user interface if you're not familiar with the term. So we're going to go to accounts, and let's see if we can do it from here. Probably not, so easiest way actually, let's back out and go to settings, right? So we're going to open up settings, and then we're going to click on accounts here. So again, I set this up to be that local account. It's not tied into Outlook or anything else like that, but it's that local account, right? And in this, we're going to go through each of these tabs. So we have your info, that basically deals with the user account name, Forest is cool, the type of account, the type of account, local account, the role, administrator, the option to sign in with a Microsoft account instead, and as well any of the picture options. So if I wanted a cool little profile picture instead of this gray guy here, I could go ahead and set that up. With the email and accounts, right? So we're going to go ahead, accidentally went ahead and picked up on this, my apologies. There we go. So with the email and accounts, generally speaking, these are used for applications. So for instance, if you have a subscription to Microsoft 365, or if you use maybe the mail application right down here, what have you, you can go ahead and set up your email account. Typically in the VM, we don't really care about this, but for personal use, there are good use cases. As well, if you're a user that tends to deal with TSV files or anything else like that, you might want to set your default app for TSVs to Excel instead of Notepad, right? So again, there are use cases on this one. It's not necessarily beneficial for the scope of user accounts, anything else like that. We're going to go ahead and go into the sign-in options instead, and this is where really the meat and potatoes of anybody that is in this IAM sphere, this Identity Access Management sphere, is going to be really probably screaming right now of, oh my gosh, we need to really cover all of this, right? For the purposes of this course, we're not going to go into depth of it. Again, it's a beginner level course, but we're going to briefly touch on this all. So, as you can see, there's 3 different options for Windows Hello. Each 3 of those options have a bit of differences behind them, right? The Windows Hello for Face, well, that's basically something where you and I are talking right now over a webcam. So a Windows Hello for Face goes ahead and authenticates you based on your face. So if you have an Apple iPhone, right, or a Samsung mobile phone, right, you tend to have Face ID now, and it goes ahead and authenticates you based on your face, how accurate it is based on what you set up at first. Windows Hello for fingerprint, right? So if you have a fingerprint ID, these are common in governments or even in any, I'd say, sensitive informations. Those Windows Hello for fingerprints, you'll get a physical fingerprint device that you have to go ahead and place your finger on to go ahead and authenticate with, right? Windows Hello Pin, this is another important one. So with Windows Hello Pin, those are going to be those pins that you generically create. Those can be a 4 to 6 digit, even a little bit longer, but Essentially, those are a numerical pen that you have. Security key, again, those are a physical security key. So think about those USBs that you plug into something. It's very typical of that. And you go ahead and authenticate with the code that is set up with that physical key. Your password, very self-explanatory. That's the password that you set up to get in. And then the picture password, right? You go ahead and tap your favorite photo. You unlock the device. It'll send a few different photos, so on and so forth. All right, and let's just go over the various other options here. So we have dynamic lock. This is something that's more or less a feature that you can pair with Bluetooth. Essentially, it locks up the device if you go ahead and have a Bluetooth device that gets out of range with it. You have the ability to restart apps, again, whenever you sign out, and restart them after you sign in. Privacy, showing the account details on the sign-in screen. So if you had a Microsoft account, right, you could say on or off, and then as well using my sign-in info to automatically finish setting up my device after an update or restart. So let's go ahead and move on from this tab. Again, as you can see, it's very, very, very intricate on it. Let's go to access work or school. This is going to be pretty self-explanatory, right? So if you guys are in school, if you're using this for work, anything else like that, typically this will be set up by default. Your IT team will go ahead and do this. If you're set up to have this device communicating with resources from your school or organization. Typically, there's no reason for anybody at a personal level to go ahead and leverage this. Let's go to family and other users. So again, this is something that you have to have your Microsoft account set up with, right? So this is where you have your family members, anybody else that can go ahead and have, the appropriate browsing time, anything else like that. So if you have kids, this might be a very beneficial area for you. Additionally, outside of that, other users, a key part on that. Set up a kiosk, right? Maybe this is a freestanding kiosk. It's a very simple sort of computer, anything else like that. You want your customers to sign in from this, right? You can do assigned access, and that could just be that digital sign in, right? Last and not least, sync your settings. That's pretty self-explanatory. If you're signed in on a Microsoft account and you get a new computer and you sign in with that Microsoft account, you can sync your settings. That way nothing else really changes and you don't lose anything. However, what we really want to do real quick is look at this family and other users. This is where we really want to get into the meat and potatoes of it, right? So notice how there are no user accounts that are associated to the machine at this time, right? There's nothing under this other users. Overall, does that mean that our account is the only one present on this machine? Now think about that for a moment. Right, so overall, that doesn't mean that our account is the only one present on this machine. It might be the only one enabled, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the only one present. So we're going to go ahead and figure out, and I'll show you how to figure this out as well. So we'll first go to this search here. Personally, I'm a fan of using the run capability. It's an application on Windows. You can always go to PowerShell, what have you, but we're just going to go to PowerShell overall right now and open that sucker up. So we're going to enter in PowerShell, and we can see users, force is cool, what have you. We're going to type in this command, get local user. All right. And so we can see that get local user, it went ahead and populated. We can see a few different accounts are actually present on this machine, right? We can see the administrator, the default account, the force is cool, the guest, and this utility account as well. Now, one key emphasis I want to point out is that this is the only one that is showing as true, right? For being enabled. So we only have one account that's enabled as of this point, but all of these accounts do exist in the background. And ultimately, they are an attack surface that an attacker can go ahead and exploit. Now, one thing I should emphasize, right? This is a security setting that Microsoft puts out there by default, right? Most users won't need to go ahead and interact with an administrator level account, a guest account, the utility account, anything else like that. this is something that most of their power users, those technical savvy folks that might be using this as a kiosk or anything else like that, right? They're going to be setting up, they're going to be enabling, disabling, whatever else it may be. And Microsoft expects that they will know what they're doing a bit more than just grandma that wants to play solitaire, right? So let's put this into a scenario. You have a computer and you want to let your grandma surf the web. But you know, each time that grandma gets on, she kind of forgets her password, right? She has to log into something, whatever it may be. And you've decided to enable the guest account just because it's easier that way to let grandma surf the web. So one thing that we're going to do it a few different ways. We're going to do first, enable local user, and we're going to put parenthesis guest. Again, very self-explanatory, right? But here's where it's going to be tricky pretty quick. Your access is denied. Now, why is that denied? Well, look at this account that I'm on. Forest is cool. What in that says that it is an administrative level account, right? Even though I have administrative level permissions, ultimately that's Microsoft trying to protect us from doing potentially damaging actions without us fully understanding what we're trying to do. So this time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just type in PowerShell directly, and I'm going to click Run as Administrator, right? And it's going to pop up saying, hey, do you want to allow this app? So on and so forth. We're going to say yes. Now, one cool thing that we're going to see immediately, look at how different this is. This now says Windows System 32. Remember, on the previous one, that says users Forest is cool. So now we can see that we're at that administrative level. We're going to do the same exact thing, that get local user, and we're going to show, hey, nothing has changed. Everything is still disabled, so on and so forth. And I'm going to maximize this just to make sure there's no concern about me doing something in the background, right? But this time, what we're going to do is enable local user guest. Now, what happened there? We don't see anything. And again, remember, we're in the CLI at this point, this command line interface. Microsoft is assuming, hey, you understand what you're doing, right? Yep, okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that command, get local user. I'm just going to upspace twice, get local user. And we can see this time, guest is now enabled. We can see that grandma now is able to get into guest. No big issue. Now, what would we go ahead and do if grandma decided, you know what, forget you, Forrest, I'm going to go buy a computer myself? Well, we don't want to just leave guest open because we already know that's a extremely bad security practice. So, again, PowerShell is pretty self-explanatory. Oh, well, we got a notification about that. That's cool. PowerShell is pretty self-explanatory. And we're going to say disable local user guest. Again, no notification, nothing else like that. But let's go ahead and just do that twice upspace, get that get local user. And we're going to see guest is now again set as false, right? Now, one thing I should emphasize is this is probably your single point of 100% truth. This is going to tell you what is or is not enabled or disabled on your computer. However, this isn't the only way to do it, right? So let's go back to this settings tab, and we're going to go to family and other users, and we're going to say add someone else to this PC. Now, one thing about Microsoft, right, it wants you to use Outlook. It's going to prompt you, hey, what's their email, what's their phone? We're going to click, I don't have this person's sign-in information. And it's going to say, well, create a new account. Awesome. Yeah, sign up for us. We don't care. We're going to say add a user without a Microsoft account. And who's going to use this PC? Right, for the sake of this, we're not going to provide a password. We're just going to say grandma. Remember, grandma can't remember her password for anything. So we want to just make it as easy as possible for grandma to log in. So we're just going to say grandma's going to use this. We're not giving a password, anything else like that. We're going to click on next, and we can see grandma is now set as a local account. Now, let's go ahead and open we're going to click on this and select change account type, right? And we can see that grandma is set to a standard user, not an administrator. We're not too concerned about that. We don't want grandma to be an administrator, right? She's only going to be playing solitaire. It's all good. So we're going to cancel out of that and just go back to this PowerShell here, right? Now, one key emphasis, we're going to use the same one, and we're going to do that get local user. Now, one key thing you might have noticed, grandma is now there, and grandma is enabled. So, again, grandma is here as that single point of truth. We're going to go ahead and remove grandma, though, because, again, remember, grandma got her own computer. She doesn't want our stinking computer anymore, so we got to remove her. So, what we're going to do is do that again, disable, or I'm sorry, we're going to do a remove local user grandma. And again, we're going to do that get local just to make sure, and we can see grandma's no longer there. If we look here and go back to family and settings, it typically requires you to get off the page that you were on. We can see grandma's no longer there. Now, let's go ahead and do that in reverse, right? Like I said, the GUI isn't exactly that single point of truth for you to understand. So, let's go ahead in this PowerShell, do this new local user, and we'll do grandma, and we'll give a dash disabled, and we'll do description for grandma with a heart, right? And it wants us to go ahead and give a password. We don't want to give a password to grandma, so we're just going to enter, and we can see right there, name grandma, enabled false, description for grandma with a heart. If we do get local user, grandma is there, disabled, description for grandma with a heart, right? Now, one key thing I do want to emphasize, if we go back here, the family and other users, right? You saw that there was a delay beforehand, but we're going ahead and trying to get into here. We're not seeing anybody added. Now, what's the deal with that, right? So, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to just remove grandma from here. Now, again, part of the reason is because just you didn't add it through the GUI, but the other aspect on it too is the CLI is a better source of truth whenever it comes down to it. So, we're going to remove grandma. Like everything in these demos, we're going to clean up after ourselves, right? We don't want to leave anything that we've done and leave it open there. So we're going to go ahead and once again remove local user grandma. So unfortunately, grandma still has her computer. She doesn't want our stinking computer, whatever it may be. We went ahead, ran that command, remove local user grandma, and then get local user. We can see that grandma is now removed. So overall, in this demo, the idea is, well, it's about getting a little familiar with PowerShell. Those are a little bit of sprinkles on it, right? But the idea is being familiar with how these user accounts may be interacted with, if they're enabled, if they're disabled, how you add them, how you delete them, how you remove them, how you can use the GUI, how you can use the CLI, so on and so forth. It's just getting familiar with it, and you're going to be able to be exposed to that in the demo itself, or I'm sorry, in the lab itself here. So, again, one key emphasis, everything will always be cleaned up. So let's go ahead and dive back into the PowerPoint here. Alright, so we finished out this demo here. We're going to go ahead and just briefly cover the GUI versus CLI. As we saw in the demo, right, we were able to see two different methods. That GUI, that graphical user interface, something that most of us are familiar with. Heck, I like the GUI sometimes even more. And then as well, we saw the CLI, that command line interface, that PowerShell aspect on it all. Now, here's the thing, folks. Most home users, and that includes myself, we prefer the GUI. It's something that's literally designed for us. That's something that all of these vendors, Microsoft, Apple, Unix, anybody has designed to say, these people will like this graphical interface more than anything else. And that's fine, right? That gets the job done for, I'd say, 95% of what we want to do. However, there are capabilities and mechanisms that we want to use the CLI for. Now, one key thing I do want to emphasize, the CLI, it's extremely powerful, right? It can really mess up your computer if you don't know what you're doing, so always exceed, and if you're ever questioning it, always don't use the CLI, right? Double check, triple check, do it in a demo environment, whatever else it may be. So let's go ahead and move on from here. So your simple question, especially if you're looking at that demo, why wouldn't you just want to be an administrator for everything? I mean, after all, we saw that administrator worked. And that's how we went ahead and got everything successfully done in that CLI, right? And the key reasons behind it, folks, are these 4 pillars on the screen: the security, privacy, avoidance of accidents, and the ease of conducting administrative actions. Now, getting into that a little bit more in depth, generally we don't want to be signed into that administrative level account for everything, right? That would mean the moment that we're compromised, maybe somebody got our password, maybe we set up a PIN, maybe we didn't even set up a password, right? The bad actor, that attacker, that hacker will essentially have these endless rights. And especially if we're logging in with the same information, if I'm saying Forrest is cool on every single account, that's easy for a bad actor to go ahead and exploit, right? Now, this is extremely critical because if you're using an account that's signed into your Microsoft account or any other account similar to it, that could always allow for sync of all of your information onto any of those computers. Remember, we saw that setting, sync to whatever, so just be careful on that. As well, privacy is equally important, right? If it's a family computer, if it's a business computer, shared computer, whatever else it may be, multi-user, you probably should not have administrative rights to everything, because that means you can go ahead and see what everybody else is doing, and whether or not that's legal or illegal, or you're contractually able to do it, or not contractually able to do it, there is a concern about ethics there. And generally, whenever it comes to ethics, I always advise erring on the side of caution, right? The accidents, well, these do happen, folks. The most sophisticated technical individuals can still have accidents. They can still cause the same issues that a beginner user can, right? The higher you get in technology, the less technical you tend to get, unfortunately, just because of the holistic approach that you have to take. Now, it's not something to say you should never have administrative access, but that means it shouldn't be your daily driver, right? Think of a car, right? If you are having to drive, let's just say, and apologies for anybody that is not in the U.S., 800 miles, right? Are you going to take your Hummer that eats 10 miles per gallon at the best, or are you going to take your Honda Civic that gets 40 miles per gallon, right? You're going to take your daily driver, that Honda Civic, to go ahead and get you from point A to point B. Very similarly, you should not use this administrative account as your daily driver. You should not do that 800 miles on it, right? You could accidentally lock up your computer if you inadvertently change any of the settings without fully understanding them. And then, as you saw, it's relatively easy, folks. You can easily use administrative level commands, actions, so on and so forth, especially in Windows systems, as long as your settings are there. For most of our personal accounts, or I should say personal computers, you will be able to do that administrative action with ease. And even for most of the Linux-based distributions, you have an authentication ability as root. You can do sudo su or sudo sh based session to conduct any of the admin activities in the CLI. Now, what that means is, should you only have a single user account? And unfortunately, we can't answer that, right? This is a tricky part about tech. You cannot always get this one size answer fits all. Typically, what I always encourage is only use what you need. If you have a family of 6, probably should have multiple accounts, right? Especially if you're all using the same computer. However, if you're a single person if you're only using the computer, maybe you have two people only using the computer, your partners, what have you, um, you might only need one single user account. The main emphasis on this all, though, is this is based on what your situation is and what makes sense for you. The main thing I would always advise having that account with administrative privileges enabled. So as we saw, we could right click and run as admin. That's easy. But don't overbloat your accounts, right? If you have an Uncle Ron that you haven't seen in 7 years and lives 6 hours away, you probably don't need a user account for Uncle Ron, right? You can go ahead and say, well, Uncle Ron, if you need to, I'll sign in for you, whatever it may be, right? But that said, this all comes back to credentials. And as we spoke about with default credentials, again, bringing it back up here, this case study, right? Emphasis on this case study. Remember, default credentials are terrible. Now that we've seen a bit of these, look at all of these various top default credentials by hackers, right? In this case, we don't see any of the administrator necessarily, but we can see user 1234, user 123456, root and root, all these other attributes, right? Please, 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 and even in this, top passwords, no pass. So please always, always change any of those default credentials if you need to. I won't harp on the case study again, just like we did in the earlier module, but I just did want to bring this up. So going back to the presentation here, just again, remember, default credentials provides a way in for the bad actors here. Now, again, these types of accounts that are common for home computers, right? In the demo, we saw with Grandma's account in the settings how we could set the account to administrator or standard. Part of that goal behind having user accounts are also having the correct permissions allocated to them. That means that Grandma shouldn't have the administrative level of permissions, or maybe she should. Maybe Grandma is a technical wizard and she is awesome, right? You just have to know the situation and appropriate the correct permissions based on what you need. A good rule of thumb, though, is unless someone is explicitly stating or even indirectly stating they need this level of access, don't provide it to them, right? Grandma from our demo doesn't need to be a computer admin. She can be a standard account for a normal standard task. One thing we did gloss over a little bit, though, the pins, the passwords, faces, so on and so forth. So part of this is, we have these crucial factors behind this, and these are what we call these multi-factor authentications, right? On Windows, these don't necessarily end up being multi-factor all of the time. These tend to be, your username and one of these, what so forth. But typically what will happen in an enterprise environment is you enter in your username, you enter in your password, and then you enter in another factor, right? So what I mean by factor, so your username and password, so your username, it's something you know, your password, it's something you know. However, there are other factors, something like what you are. So for instance, me, I have brown hair. So that is something of another factor, right? What I am. As well, fingerprint. That's something I am. That's another factor, so to speak. So again, these are all factors that you can go ahead and leverage for the sake of signing in with Windows machines. Commonly for your home, you will have the option to go ahead and sign in with some capabilities of Windows Hello. I do want to emphasize, however, that does not mean that you can go ahead and sign in with all of them. Some computers only support some methods. Now, again, we're not going to go ahead and go in depth about multi-factor authentication like hardware tokens or anything else like that, because those are out of scope for the beginner scope of this course. But essentially, the breakdown of it is the more layers of authorization you can provide, the better within reason, right? Main reason I always say within reason, you shouldn't have pigeon carriers or, owl mail or snail mail or anything else like that as a form of authentication. You shouldn't make your users jump 3 times and pat their belly or something like that, right? You want to be within reason of what's going on. So, all of that to say, we now have an at-home lab. Now, one key thing I do want to emphasize, again, do not, and do not conduct these labs on your personal computer. Leverage VirtualBox for this. The VM environment is going to be present in that OVA file that is provided. Alphagrad should have the OVA file. I'm going to temporarily host it while they go ahead and migrate it to wherever they want to have it, but that OVA file should be available at that point. And as part of the series, right, you're going to have this independent lab activity. This isn't something that's going to be graded. You're not going to be impacted by it. I'm not going to be calling your parents, anything like that. But this is for you to get hands-on experience for similar topics of what we talked about. So, without me just being vague about it, let's talk about it. So, Lab 1, these user account scenarios, right? So, you're the singular user of this Windows 10 machine. You've been reading about increasing cybercrime targeting individuals, and with such, you want to system harden your machine as best as possible. There should only ever be an account of Lab that is enabled and a user account of Alphagrad that is disabled. Now, again, key emphasis, there should only ever be an account of Lab that is enabled and a user account of Alphagrad that is disabled. So that is going to be your objective for the lab. Again, I'm going to be turning over all of these documents to the Alphagrad team, but I will temporarily be hosting them for accessibility. So what you need to do to prepare for the upcoming sessions, please, 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 again, this is for your own benefit, complete the Lab 1 for these hands-on experiences, right? Always make sure your VirtualBox is up to date. And again, key emphasis. Alphagrad, myself, we cannot take any of the responsibility for supporting your machine, be that your host machine or your virtual machine, and troubleshooting VirtualBox. All of this material is owned by Alphagrad, but again, we cannot take that accountability for supporting the machine and troubleshooting your VirtualBox. Any of the questions and comments or observations in this, please definitely go ahead and communicate that in the Alphagrad Discord. The admin team, myself, we're all pretty active in there, so if you have any concerns, please definitely reach out there. And again, this material is all owned by the Alphagrad administration team, so please definitely reach out if you have any concerns or questions about the material there. Now, again, one thing we always want to close on is a good note. What we're going to be doing next, right? So in the upcoming session, we're going to be proceeding to evaluate some of these built-in security settings that are deployed, like these Windows security modules. So we're going to have a bit of fun here, and again, we're going to just be exploring. So overall, again, everybody, thank you for all your time. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to interacting with you all. Again, if there's any questions, please reach out to the Alphagrad Discord community. Thank you, and bye-bye.